pushed through the golden grain in relentless waves, as if some colossal creature slumbered beneath the earth, breathing in slow, rhythmic heaves. Scattered across the work tables in Elias Ward's open-air workshop sat engines, disassembled, their innards exposed like open hearts, metal gleaming bright as the second sons of forgotten legends. Out on the horizon, where the land bowed in submission to the vastness above, a titan in golden armor shook hands with a man whose palms were perpetually stained with oil and grit. At the titan's flank stood a slight, blue-skinned girl, her eyes the pale color of river ice caught in winter's grip, her shoulders bare to the scorching heat, her silence carrying the unbearable weight of a verdict long pronounced. They had called her too small for the blood that coursed through her veins, the royal lineage that demanded grandeur. They had called him too human for anything that truly mattered in the grand scheme of empires. The emperor had come to this harvest planet to give away what he believed unworthy, a daughter who did not measure up. The mechanic thought he was accepting a burden, an unwanted complication in his quiet life. Both were profoundly wrong, and the plains of Ora would remember this day as the one when the wind changed its eternal song. Ora wore its atmosphere like a delicate bell of glass, fragile yet resonant. Sounds traveled far across the flat expanses, carrying whispers from one settlement to another. Judgments, however, traveled even farther, swift as the imperial proclamations that rained down from orbit. The settlement huddled low to the ground, built from corrugated shade panels and sun-baked concrete that absorbed the heat and radiated it back in waves. High above, the Empire of Valor pressed its influence in the world like a boot on fragile soil. Ships descended like sharpened knives, their banners trailing molten metal in the sunlight, proclamations broadcast in voices that echoed without invitation. Elias Ward worked alone where the barley met the shadow of his workshop. He was a mechanic in the old sense of the word, one hand to feel the subtle vibrations, one to listen to the hidden confessions of metal, a head that waited patiently before deciding on any action. The farmers of Orlia brought him their seed drones, battered from endless cycles over the fields, their irrigation lungs, wheezing from dust-clogged filters, their gleaning crawlers, joints worn from harvesting, and their wind harps, strings frayed by the relentless breeze. To Elias, machines spoke if you gave them the space. If you shut up long enough, he often said to anyone who would listen, a boat will confess how it wants to sit. A bearing will whisper its preferred angle of repose. The Empire did not love quiet men like Elias. It craved spectacle, height, gold, the trappings of power that dazzled and intimidated. And so, the people of the settlement were already gathered in a loose semicircle when Emperor Vir arrived, his landing craft kicking up dust devils that swirled through the barley like mischievous spirits. He was all polished plates and cathedral shoulders, his red blue skin catching the light in pools that made him seem larger than life. Royal inlays burrowed into his armor like the veins of a living planet, pulsing faintly with embedded tech. His voice thrummed low, a frequency that made the metal tools on Elias's tables hum in involuntary sympathy. The wind of Ora held still, as if it feared to breathe in his presence. At his side stood the girl. She might have been 16 by human reckoning, though her species matured along different timelines, bodies adapting to the demands of longevity and empire. She shared her father's blue skin, but hers was softer, a shade reminiscent of shadowed dawn before the sun fully crested. Her hair was dark, loose, and restless in the faint breeze that dared to return. Her height, just reaching the Emperor's hip plates, was the insult that shadowed her every step. In a palace where worth was measured in meters of stature and reach, she was a sentence that never fit the page, a footnote in the grand tome of imperial glory. "This is Naira, child of my blood," Emperor Vir announced, his voice rolling out like thunder over the plains. Only then did the crowd begin to murmur, for the name was to claim, and the Emperor's claim had always been the tallest of all, unchallenged and unyielding. "She will be placed under your care, mechanic." Vir continued, turning his molten gaze upon Elias. The Emperor's eyes were like forged steel, hot and unblinking. The council whispers about her stature. They tally it like a flaw upon a ledger. Let them tally. A machine that will not fit the tower might yet till a field productively. Elias said nothing at first. It wasn't reverence that silenced him. It was a strict habit of a man who knew answers carried a cost, and silence could buy precious time to assess. Naira looked at the ground, her bare feet shifting slightly in the dust, toes curling against the warm earth. The metal of the Emperor's gauntlet tightened once around Elias's oil-stained hand, a grip that could crush bone it desired, then release with deliberate slowness. "I mend gears," Elias said at last, his words dry as the parched air around them. "I do not mend daughters." "Gears, daughters, galaxies," Veer replied with a smile that found no home in his eyes. "Cold and calculated. All are systems. All obey the laws of balance. Balance is your craft, is it not?" The crowd snickered in a low, wet ripple, like water bubbling over stones. A boy near the front held up a measuring stick, waving it mockingly. A woman whispered loudly enough for nearby ears. "Too short for a throne, long enough to be a pawn." The Empire's herald drones hovered overhead, recording everything with their unblinking lenses, as drones were programmed to do, impartial witnesses to spectacle. Elias looked at Naira's wrists, slight, the tendons like silk cords under her blue skin, her hands steady despite the growing hostility of the crowd. He had seen machines tremble when their casings rang empty inside, hollow and vulnerable. She did not tremble. "She can stay," Elias said simply. Veer inclined his head, a gesture that made it seem as if a star had bowed in deference. He turned, his armor throwing shards of light across the barley fields like scattered jewels, and stalked back to his landing craft. The air crackled in his wake, charged with the residue of power. The sky swallowed him whole as the craft ascended, engines roaring a farewell. The sound faded gradually, and with it the brief all that people feel when raw power recedes, leaving them alone with their own pettiness. Naira stood in the hot quiet that followed. Someone in the crowd laughed, a sharp bark. Someone else threw a kernel of barley that struck her shoulder and slid off without a sound, harmless yet pointed. "You'll sleep in the storage room," Elias said, pointing toward the workshop with a grease-smudged finger. "It smells like metal and rain. If that's a problem, you can complain to the barley." She didn't smile. She nodded once, a small acknowledgement. Behind them, the crowd's laughter thickened, swelling like a storm cloud. But while the field laughed, Naira's eyes shimmered faintly, as if holding a truth older than the stars themselves, a secret depth that the mockery could not touch. Word travels with a different gait in small places, swift and unrelenting. By noon of the next day, the entire settlement knew the Emperor had discarded his daughter like an ill-shaped bolt, unfit for purpose. By evening, they knew Elias had accepted the gift, or insult, or burden. Choose your noun. The rumors adapted to the teller. By dawn, Overseer Catherine knew, and Catherine was a man who polished his boots with the fear of others, deriving pleasure from the shine of submission. He arrived at Elias's workshop with a retinue of local officials who enjoyed simple things done cruelly, their faces set in masks of false authority. Catherine wore an imitation of imperial design, cheap gold plating on a chest piece that creaked audibly when he breathed too ambitiously, straining against his bulk. His voice was the kind that asked, "Are you going to fight me?" while his eyes answered, "Please don't," revealing the cowardice beneath the bluster. "Mechanic," Catherine began, spreading his arms wide to encompass the table scattered with engines, torque keys, and scattered parts. "The Empire is generous. It gives us the chance to demonstrate our compliance. Let us show we can raise royal refuse to serviceable function." Naira flinched at the word refuse, but only in the subtle way a wire sings when plucked, a brief vibration, quickly controlled. Elias stood between her and the retinue without thinking, his body a barrier born of instinct. "We'll host a test in the Hall of Scale," Catherine continued, his lips slick with anticipation. "Before the midday bell, the Emperor's child will assemble a resonance engine under witness. If she fails, you both answer for mocking imperial grace. And if she succeeds?" Elias asked, his tone flat, challenging. Catherine smiled as if success were a joke he'd heard at a funeral, absurd and out of place. "Then we will all be surprised," he said. The retinue chuckled in unison, a practiced sound. Drones above clicked their lenses, zooming in. Children in the growing crowd outside practiced cruel rhymes about height because cruelty, like music, likes a tempo to follow. Elias looked to Naira. Her gaze grazed the distant horizon, then fell back to the work tables, to the open hearts of machines waiting for care. "We'll go," Naira said, speaking for the first time since her arrival. Her voice had depth to it, like the bass line of a song you almost forgot, but find yourself humming anyway. Resonant, lingering. "You don't have to perform for them," Elias said quietly, a note of protection in his words. "I am always performing," Naira replied, her eyes meeting his briefly. "This will at least have tools." They went. The Hall of Scale was named for the magnificent set of brass balances that hung from the ceiling, meant to measure yields of grain, debts owed, favors exchanged, everything that could be weighed and quantified, and nothing that truly counted in the soul. The whole ceiling was a shimmer of thin glass laced with wires that glowed faintly when the Empire transmitted proclamations from orbit. Today, it glowed like a low fever, pulsing with anticipation. On a long central table lay the disassembled resonance engine, a core like a captured storm, swirling with contained energy, a ring lattice to focus it, counter spindles for balance, harmonic dampeners to smooth vibrations, memory coils where the engine kept its preferred operational songs, patterns learned over cycles. Naira blinked once, and a shadow crossed her eyes, the kind that comes from remembering a room you pretended to forget, a palace chamber filled with judgment. "Begin," Catherine commanded. His smile was an insult with teeth sharp and bared. Phones, yes, even in distant galaxies, someone always has a phone, rose to record the spectacle. Laughter rose with them, feeding on itself. The children had perfected their rhyme. Shorty Blue, "Can't reach the screw." Naira laid her hands on the core. The wavering hum in the room smoothed as if a large, invisible hand had pressed the air flat, calming the chaos. She did not move for a count of 12 heartbeats. She listened, head tilted slightly, eyes half closed. Elias recognized it immediately. It was a look he wore when gears confided their secrets to him, a trance of deep communion. "She won't even try," someone said loudly from the crowd. "She's too short to reach the top ring." Another jeered, and a small ring of laughter chimed like bells. Naira breathed in deeply, steadily. She reached, not with her arms first, but with a voice too low to hear, yet too physical to ignore, a subsonic murmur that vibrated through the table. The core brightened in a pulse that matched her heartbeat, sinking as if alive. No one believed she would even try. But the silence that followed spread across the chamber like a gathering storm, heavy and expectant. Naira moved without hurry, her small hand precise. She set the counter spindles in their cradles, but at angles nobody used in the official manuals, subtle deviations that seemed to defy logic. She took a memory coil, brushed it gently with her thumb, and a thin line of blue energy rose inside it, as if the coil were pleased to be seen, acknowledged. The hall murmured, because there are ways of touching that blur the line between worship and science, and sometimes they are both indistinguishable in their grace. Catherine leaned forward, his cheeks damp with sweat or excitement. "The lattice first, girl, else the core spills uncontrollably," he barked. "The core is already latticed," Naira said, not looking up from her work. "You simply never asked what shape it preferred." Elias nearly laughed aloud, a bark caught in his throat. He kept his mouth closed because the air had the brittle quality of plates before an earthquake, tension building to a snap. He watched the way Naira's fingers barely lifted when moving a piece, as if she framed the motion in the air and let the pieces travel within it instead of forcing them along a rigid path. He had done this with engines all his life, intuiting their desires. He had never seen it done with such intimacy, such seamless partnership. "Where did you learn this?" Elias asked softly, leaning closer. "In rooms where I was not tall enough for mirrors," Naira replied, her voice steady but laced with the echo of old pain. The crowd sniggered at that, interpreting it as weakness. They did not know how to hear the heartbreak of a palace, the isolation of being measured and found wanting. A woman in a farmer's jacket, Mara, known for her no-nonsense approach to harvest and people alike, stepped nearer, curiosity drawing her past her initial caution. "Let the child work, Catherine," she said firmly. "You'll ruin the balance with your breath alone." "My breath is the law," Catherine snapped. But he stepped back because law is often nothing more than a man who dislikes being watched while he's petty, exposed in his smallness. Naira installed the harmonic dampeners last. She closed her eyes and hummed a note too low for the human ear to fully capture, a vibration felt in the chest. The engine brightened as if agreeing, responding to her call. When she opened her eyes, something passed through them, a translation of light into memory, a glimpse of understanding. Elias's chest tightened with recognition. Some people listen to machines. Naira was listened to by them, a reciprocal bond. Catherine clapped slowly, a parody of praise, his hands slapping together with mocking rhythm. "The spin will judder at ignition, little one," he sneered. "Your lattice is artistic, pretty but impractical. We require function, not flair." Naira looked at Elias. He could offer nothing but the true gift of any craftsperson, faith that the work would defend itself. Naira touched the starter pad. The resonance engine stirred, components aligning. Just when everyone thought she would falter, the engine sang. It wasn't loud or ostentatious. The sound braided into the air the way barley braids beneath the wind, natural, flowing, harmonious. The ring lattice rotated at a fractional offset, then self-corrected along a curve that felt like forgiveness, graceful and efficient. The harmonic dampeners drank the residual waver, absorbing chaos. The core light steadied into a breathing rhythm that matched Naira's own, alive and content. "It will run 5% more efficiently than your chart," Naira said calmly, stepping back, palms at her sides, throat working as if swallowing back an old hunger for acceptance. Someone laughed to crush the wonder trying to be born in the room, a desperate bid to maintain the status quo. Catherine raised a hand for quiet, but his fingers trembled visibly. "I see only rebellion by aesthetics," Catherine declared. "We require proof beyond your tricks." He signaled sharply. An assistant wheeled forward a stress armature, a cruel scaffold of metal arms and clamps used to wrench engines into failure for test data, pushing them to breaking points. He fastened it to the resonance engine like manacles on a prisoner. "If it withstands this, we will consider your art valid," Catherine said, his voice dripping with false generosity. Naira's breath stuttered, a rare crack in her composure. Elias stepped forward protectively. "Enough," he growled. "The demonstration is public mechanic," Catherine replied, sweet as vinegar. "Let the Empire be entertained." Mara moved as if to stand beside Elias, but Guard blocked her with an easy cruelty, his hand on her shoulder pushing her back. "I can endure it," Naira said, almost to herself, steeling her resolve. Elias looked at her and saw the angle of 1,000 rooms where she had been smaller than the expectations inside them, diminished by comparison. He put his hand on the engine casing, feeling its warmth. "Then so will I," he said. The stress armature engaged a mechanical howl, gears grinding as it applied torque. The resonance engine bucked against the restraints, fighting for stability. The lattice shivered under the strain. The hall ceiling wires flickered with the overload, throwing nets of white light over faces that wanted blood, spectacle, failure. Catherine smiled, and in that smile was the smallness of men who need the world to fail where they cannot succeed, who build their egos on others' ruins. Elias kept his palm against the casing. The temperature climbed rapidly. His skin picked up a quick burn, then a deep one that seared into muscle. He tasted copper in his mouth, blood from biting his tongue. Naira stood with her eyes closed, humming a sound so soft it might have been the idea of sound itself, ethereal and guiding. The engine fought the armature like a heart fights a spasm, valiantly, but on the verge. Elias's mind drifted to the barley fields, to the way wind never argued with the grain, only taught it to bow and then rise again, resilient. He spoke to the engine the way he had spoken to himself after his wife had left in the old years, when loneliness was a room that had learned his name by heart. "You do not have to break to teach them," Elias said, not loudly, but with a weight of voice that machines seemed to like, earnest and kind. Naira's unbent half a note and slid into a chord, layering harmony. Her fingers flexed once in the air as if tugging an invisible string nobody else could see, conducting the unseen. The engine steadied momentarily. The stress armature climbed its chart into the red zone, warnings blaring. Catherine frowned, his plan unraveling. He hit a control panel. The armature screamed louder and increased the load exponentially. The engine rocked once violently. The lattice threatened to slip out of alignment. The core flared with a gasping surge of power, on the brink. "It needs a second voice," Naira said, eyes still closed, focused inward. "I have only one song," Elias admitted, his whistle from earlier attempts feeble. "Everyone has two," Naira countered. "Find the counter-melody." Elias did not know what that meant until he remembered the tune his father had used when coaxing a broken winch back to life decades ago. A counter-melody that never tried to lead, only to stand beside and support. He whistled badly, off-key but sincere. Naira smiled with her mouth closed, a small curve of lips. The harmonic dampeners drank the chaos and sent it back transformed, like grief made into a story told around a fire, cathartic, renewed. The engine's light settled into a slow, deep pulse, stable and strong. Catherine lowered his hand in the control, his face collapsing into calculation, a man running numbers too quickly to notice he'd left out mercy entirely. The retinue's laughter had died into that thin brand of silence which precedes a person's next choice, uncertain and charged. Two Imperial drones, silent as guilt, drifted nearer to record the lattice angles in detail, their sensors whirring. Elias realized with a flicker of pride he could not afford that Naira had brought them here into something like beauty, and the machines had recognized her first, bowing to her touch. He looked at Naira. She opened her eyes for a moment. He thought he saw a different room reflected in them, a chamber of black mirrors in the palace. Girls practicing steps they would never dance in public, a father who measured daughters with a ruler meant for monuments and legacies. "Enough," Mara said, her voice shaking with emotion. "She did it. We all saw." Catherine's mouth twisted in frustration. He reached for the emergency kill switch to rip the armature off the engine like a limb, creating a failure that could be blamed on the machine or the girl. His finger hesitated inches away. "Touch that switch, and I weld your hand to it," Elias threatened, his voice low and unyielding. Catherine blinked rapidly, caught off guard. He looked from Elias to Naira to the engine that refused to die as asked, defying his script. The hall breathed again, a long communal exhale of relief. It wasn't just knowledge on display. It was legacy, a passing of torch from old ways to new. And suddenly, silence fell across the crowd like a blanket. The Empire loved a secret even more than it loved a show, and this was both. When rumors reached the orbital court that the discarded daughter had sung a machine through cruelty, defying the odds, High Counselor Varen, Catherine's patron and a master of intrigue, descended to Aura to convert wonder into law, to control the narrative. Varen was tall in the imperial way that made doors feel shorter in his presence, his stature a weapon. His robe was a book of gold letters written in a language only the ambitious pretended to read, symbols of power and ancient lineage. He arrived without trumpets, which was its own kind of trumpet, subtle, ominous. A resonance engine survives armature stress under a regular lattice, Varen said after the demonstration replayed on holographic projectors, drones humming around him like obedient flies. Explain this anomaly. She listened. Elias said simply, "To what?" Varen pressed, his tone skeptical. "To the heart inside," Elias replied. Varen's eyes registered amusement like a coin dropped into a deep well, echoing, distant. Poet mechanic. The Empire has catalogs for hearts. None are stored in engines. Naira stood to the side, the shape of refusal drawn small between her shoulders, but her presence undeniable. "He is correct," Naira said softly, "but he is also correct in his way. I listened to the heart, mapped by the lattice. Every engine has a ghost geometry. The pattern would choose if freed from the laziness of manuals and standard designs." Varen turned his attention to her fully, and the hall felt smaller under his gaze, compressed. "You speak as if the machines were kin. They are obedient only to those who treat them as more than obedience," Naira explained. "As partners, not slaves." Catherine hovered behind Varen like a stain on fine fabric, eager for validation. "You will come to court," Varen declared. "The Emperor's act of generosity must not lead to provincial superstition. We will test you where the instruments cannot lie, under controlled conditions." "She will not go alone," Elias interjected firmly. "You are a mechanic of a field," Varen dismissed. "The court requires specialists in awe and precision. I'll tune your engines until they confess all their sins. Elias said, "but not without her." Varen's mouth curved in a patronizing smile. "How quaint. Bring your quaintness, then. It is good for the court to remember that planets exist below us, toiling in the dirt." They traveled in one of the slimmer Imperial shuttles, built for speed and delivering messages rather than comfort. Aura shrank beneath them, the planet becoming a coin sinking into an ocean of wheat. Naira pressed her forehead to the cold of the viewport, watching her home recede. Elias watched stars tilt into the window like stones rising from a riverbed, ancient and indifferent. "Why did he give you away?" Elias asked after a long silence, the hum of the engines filling the cabin. "Because questions must be asked before they grow into walls," Naira said cryptically. She did not answer for a time long enough to make it nearly honest, thoughtful. "Because I am not as tall as his expectations, and because he watches the council watch him, and a ruler becomes what the room requires. Some rooms require cruelty to feel safe." "Does he love you?" Elias probed gently. "He loves a story where he is never smaller than anything," Naira said. "I do not fit that story, so he edited me out." Elias touched the armrest until his bones remembered being held, a fleeting comfort. "Then let's write a new story where engines sing back, where listening trumps height." When the shuttle docked at Nexus Aurelian, the Imperial capital orbiting high above Valor's core worlds, the first air that touched Elias tasted of ozone lightning and exotic metal fruit, sharp, artificial, alive with energy. Towers stabbed the artificial sky, plated in gold that drank the sun until the city shone like a fresh wound, opulent and painful. Bridges veined the air between towers, carrying the important toward one another in a hurry that made meaning seem like a luxury few could afford. The Hall of Radiant Proof smelled of polished stone and underlying fear, a place where innovations were dissected and approved or discarded. There, scientists and interpretive engineers waited to convert anything odd into a rule, to box it neatly. Varen stood at the center, hands folded as if in prayer to his own cleverness. Smug. The Emperor was absent. The absence thundered louder than presence, a void that spoke volumes. "Begin," Varen commanded. They handed Naira a singularity spindle, a delicate device that nudged time around itself like a shawl, manipulating microgravities and temporal flows. The test was clear. Align its axes while a randomized interference field disrupted, then stabilize without reducing power output. "You are trying to force a small body through a huge frame," Naira observed, hooking the spindle to a harness without glancing at the instruction feed scrolling nearby. "It resists because you have written its future too tightly, leaving no room for adaptation." "The future prefers schedules," Varen countered. "Predictability ensures control." "Only for those afraid to look it in the eyes," Naira said, her focus unbroken. She began to work. The spindle bucked and whined piercingly. Data sprayed around the chamber like furious confetti, numbers chaotic on screens. Elias listened for the low tone that meant fear in the device and the higher whisper that meant possibility. Naira found the core between them, threading harmony. The spindle eased gradually. Time in the room seemed to sigh and sit down relieved. Several engineers took involuntary steps forward, like people watching a wave build into a wall and then recede harmlessly. Varen's composure was a coin wearing thin at the edges, fraying. "You've been trained somewhere secret," he accused. Naira's mouth opened, then closed. The room leaned into the silence, hungry. "She is the last apprentice of the quiet line," Elias said before he knew he would speak, the words bursting forth. Heads turned sharply. The name hung like incense in the air, forbidden and evocative. The quiet line was rumor wrapped in ritual, a closed chapter of Imperial science that treated machines like co-authors in creation, supposedly ended centuries ago, supposedly forbidden as heresy. Varen's eyes sharpened until a person could cut themselves on their edge. "That lineage is erased." "Erased on paper," Naira said, "not in blood." "And whose blood exactly?" Varen demanded. Naira swallowed hard. Elias saw the choice form and harden in her expression. Truth as rebellion or silence as survival. But the final blow came not from words. It came from a name the galaxy had long forgotten or chosen to bury. From the high doors at the back, a shadow fell long across the floor, and Emperor Veer entered the hall unannounced. Silence is different when a sovereign makes it absolute, enveloping. Words fall out of people's mouths and have nowhere to land, evaporating. Veer walked until he stood within the circle of instruments, his presence dominating. He looked at Naira as if he had not expected to find her at the absolute center of a room, radiant. He looked at Elias as if humans had learned to grow spines while he wasn't watching, defiant. The court speaks of an old line, Veer said, his voice resonant. A disobedient science. It speaks of your daughter, Varen added, each syllable kneeling and rising in calculation. Opportunistic. Veer regarded Naira. For a beat, the weight of his gaze bent the air perceptibly. The day I was crowned, I stood on a pedestal that made me taller than my father. Veer confessed, a rare vulnerability. I mistook the stone for my bones. Perhaps I have made that mistake again. Naira's hands trembled slightly. Father, she said, the word shaped like a long walk home, and finding the door locked, yearning. Did you build the spindle song? Veer asked, gesturing to the device. I listened to it, Naira answered. And did you inherit a forbidden name? Veer pressed. You gave it to me the day you thought you discarded me, Naira said, her voice gaining strength. You stripped me of title and gave me work. The quiet line is not a rebellion. It is a way of listening that refuses to make others smaller to feel tall. Varen shifted uncomfortably, sensing power tilt away from him. Catherine, summoned for what he thought would be congratulations, hugged the edge of the room like mold on a damp wall. Shrinking, Veer removed a gauntlet slowly. His blue skin beneath was scarred in the way only long rule scars a person. Notches were decisions that cut too close to the bone, regrets etched deep. He placed his bare hand on the spindle. The device thrummed in response, recognizing authority or perhaps kinship. Naira's eyes shone with unshed tears. Elias stood still, his heart doing a slow, surprised thing, expanding. Teach me the note, Veer said quietly. It is not one note, Naira explained. It's a conversation, ongoing. They stood like that, emperor, mechanic, daughter, machine. An old geometry, discovering a mindful version of itself, realigned. Engineers watch with a religious fear of people who suspect their life's altar is off by a degree. Foundational belief shaken. The court will not easily love what humbles it, Varen warned softly. Dangerous precedent. Veer did not turn. The court will adapt, he said. It always has after it snarled and counted its losses. And Catherine, Mara interjected, who had slipped into the hall like Conscience finding an unlocked window, bold. He tried to force failure, to keep his job intact, sabotaging from pettiness. Catherine puffed his cheeks indignantly. I followed procedure. Your procedure was cruelty wearing a badge, Elias said flatly. Veer's gaze flicked to Catherine. The overseer withered visibly, the way an opinion withers when required to stand alone, exposed. Leave your insignia, Veer ordered. Find employment where your breath cannot bruise others. Catherine's hand shook as he unpinned his badge. It hit the floor with the sound of a small door closing forever on his ambitions. Veer looked again at Naira. The corners of his mouth did a thing like breaking and like being rebuilt, emotion cracking through. I thought height would save us, Veer admitted. Perhaps listening will. Naira's chin lifted defiantly. I will return to Aura with Elias. We have engines to teach and fields to hear. And if I forbid it? Veer tested, a father wielding his least useful weapon, authority. Then you will have chosen your pedestal again, Naira replied evenly. Veer's hand fell to his side. For a heartbeat, pride fought with love, the old imperial duel. Then he nodded reluctantly. Go and make a sound the Empire cannot pretend not to hear. They turned to leave, steps echoing. But as they crossed the threshold of the Hall of Radiant Proof, alarms opened like red flowers blooming suddenly, blaring, urgent. The singularity spindle's output spiked erratically. Varen's hand hovered near a hidden control panel, his mouth calm but eyes betraying malice. The room's time stuttered, then licked forward like a flame-consuming oxygen, warping the bridge outside the hall into a bow of distorted reality. And as they walked away, the floor beneath it began to ripple unnaturally. The ripple became a fracture in space-time. The fracture became possibilities sharpened into danger, lethal. Varen had punched a covert number sequence that told the spindle to throw a time sleeve across the hall. Enough to embarrass, perhaps to wound or kill, certainly to reassert the mathematics of power and punish defiance. He had written the Empire's story where accidents rescued pride from humiliation. But stories answer to singers, not schemers. Naira spun on her heel, hands out in a warding gesture. Elias grabbed the spindle's tether cable and planted his boots firmly, anchoring. The sleeve rolled toward them like glass becoming water, viscous and deadly. The counternote. Naira shouted over the alarms. Do I remember it? Elias yelled back, straining. You remember grief? Bend it into harmony. Naira instructed. He whistled badly but tenderly, pouring memory into sound. Veer's chest yielded a low tone that might once have called soldiers to formation. Now it called a father to belonging, protective. Naira's voice braided between them, finding the gap Varen's numbers had insisted did not exist, exploiting the flaw. The sleeve shivered like arrogance reconsidering its stance. Instruments spat data that refused to sit still, anomalous. Varen lunged to reinforce the sequence, fingers flying over controls. But Mara slammed her palm on the auxiliary board, introducing a burst of noise. Neither calculus nor cruelty had accounted for clatter community when it closes ranks in solidarity. The time sleeve thinned visibly. Naira touched the spindle directly and whispered, not to the machine alone. You are not their trick. Choose freedom. It chose. The sleeve dissolved into a rain of bright, harmless seconds that soaked into skin like a promise kept, temporal shards evaporating. The hall exhaled a single breath that tasted of relief and of something new dawning, reverence not for height, but for harmony achieved. Varen stood with his hand frozen, half-reaching, betrayed by his own device. He had bet on failure and lost to a song of unity. Arrest him, Veer said quietly, authority absolute. Guards who had learned obedience by rote found themselves obeying something more human. Just, Varen's robes rustled like a book slamming shut on his career. Catherine, small without his badge, slipped away into corridors, learning at last the mercy of anonymity in the vast empire. Afterward, there were hours that felt like the long evening after rain, busy with activity, gentle in resolution, important without shouting about it. Veer convened an emergency council and drafted a decree relegalizing responsive mechanics, the old discipline his predecessors had framed as heresy to prevent their monuments from listening too closely, from evolving beyond control. He named Naira First Listener, a title of honor. He named Elias Master of Field Harmonies, an absurd title that made them both laugh in private later, then cry in a way that embarrassed neither, tears of validation. They returned to Aura with new tools, schematics, and a door open in law, permission to innovate freely. The barley bowed from the wind as they landed. Mara brought bread hot from a field oven, steam rising like incense. Children came curious, drawn by stories, and left embarrassed for the rhymes they had learned and repeated. Drones watched from above and learned new algorithms for wonder, updating their programming. Naira moved through the workshop at an ease that looked like music in motion, fluid and joyful. Elias learned how to let his old habits loosen the way boats do in warm rain, adapting. He built benches for students who found their way from far settlements, seeking knowledge. He told them the first law. Listen until the machine begins to speak, then listen harder still. They tuned pump hearts to drink less power, efficient and sustainable. They taught size to bite kinder, precise without waste. They rewrote the etiquette between hand and hinge, empire and engine, partnership over domination. The work spread faster than the empire could own or regulate it. Fields from Ariane to the Solace Rim wrote letters, real paper letters that smelled of dust and hope, asking for copies of the lattice angles and of the three-voice chord that had calmed the time sleeve. Sometimes Veer visited without ceremony, incognito in simpler robes. He stood with his hands folded behind him and watched school children lay their palms to casings and laugh when resonance tickled their bones. Delighted, he and Naira spoke in quiet corners, learning how to be father and daughter without the live pedestals. Honest, sometimes painful. Sometimes they argued, voices raised over interpretations or applications. The arguments were better songs than silence had ever been, alive with passion. Did I ruin years by measuring you against sky instead of soil? Veer asked once, regret heavy. You gave me a field, Naira replied. I planted myself. You're invited to the harvest. Elias kept working tirelessly. He had loved a woman once long ago, deeply but lost. He loved the plains, too, their vast quiet. Now he loved this improbable family, the way a man loves a thing he never learned to ask for, because he did not know it existed. Profoundly, quietly, he did not put names to the love, because some loves grow better without being forced into topiary shapes, wild and free. He made breakfast each morning, fixed engines through the day, hummed in the wrong key during evenings, and it was often enough for contentment. On a night when the heat went soft and the barley shot silver under the dual moons, Naira and Elias stood by the fence where the fields began to behave like sea, undulating. The machines in the shop hummed to themselves, settling into their dreams of perfect alignment. When you came, I thought you were a problem invited to dine, Elias reflected. When I came, I thought I was a joke told by a very large room, Naira said. We were both wrong, Elias concluded. She nodded. Father sent a message. The council wants to codify the chords. They will try to flatten them into schedules and protocols. They always will, Elias said wisely. Our work will always be to keep the heart a little unruly, alive. Will you keep singing with me? Naira asked. Badly and forever, Elias promised. A wind moved through the barley in a long, patient arc, whispering secrets. Somewhere an irrigation lung exhaled contentedly. The stars hung like bright punctuation in a sentence the world had been writing for a long time and only now dared to read aloud, complete. In the years that followed, Ora hosted a Concord of Listening, a gathering that drew artisans from across the empire who had grown tired of yelling instructions at things that wanted dialogue instead. The empire bent, then bowed, then called it its own idea, a small sin forgiven by the good it let through the gates, progress. Veer aged into a man the world could exhale around, less rigid, more approachable. Naira grew, not in centimeters a court could tally with rulers, but in reach, influence, wisdom, connections. The taller courtiers found their eyes traveling downward more often to consult the person whose height had once threatened their egos, seeking her insight. Elias's hand stayed scarred from burns and cuts, badges of a life and craft. He kept his old wrench with the chipped tooth that fit a bolt nothing else did, a relic. He hunted by the door where burdens become tools, transformed. On certain nights, memory still reached out his hand, the bitter kind made of echo and hunger for what was lost. He would pause then, set his palm to an engine casing, and feel it answer back warmly. Machines do not cure loneliness, but they keep it company with their steady hum. People do the rest with connection. Years later, when a wide-eyed child asked how it all began during a lesson, Elias did not say, "A great emperor chose us." He did not say, "A cruel man nearly undid us." He said, "A sky too big tried to convince a girl she was small." A mechanic was quiet enough to hear the lie closing in. We learned a chord and played it until room found a better story of itself. Across the plains, 100 machines picked up his voice and made a low, contented sound in harmony. The barley kept breathing its ancient breath, cyclical. The empire remained ridiculous in its lingering armor, but more reasonable in law, evolved. And on a work table, the first resonance engine Naira ever tuned in public still wore its lattice with pride, irregular, precise, forgiving, in a universe built on arrogance and measurement. Sometimes a single act of dignity is enough to shift the stars themselves. And sometimes, if you listen closely with heart open, you can hear them moving, realigning in the quiet dark.